I have been addicted to daily in-depth Bible studies for over a decade now. It used to be boring, but now I love reading the Bible. And it all really boils down to knowing how to do good Bible studies, how to see what's important in the text and how to know its application to life. So in this video, I'll share my 4 best tips to better grasp, understand, be met by the Lord a little bit more in your Bible studies. But first, welcome to the Bible Nerds corner of the internet. Welcome back. We've got 4 great tips and I don't want to waste any of your time. Let's go ahead and dive in. I'm really excited about the last one because I think it's totally going to transform the way that you view and understand Genesis and really Exodus and the rest of the Bible, but we'll wait. Starting off with tip number 1, I call this one beginnings are the roadmap, because oftentimes throughout the Bible, in fact, it doesn't matter like what kind of genre you are in the Bible, what book it is, like over and over and over again throughout the Bible and all the different books, the beginning of the book tells you a lot about where it's going. That's why it's called the beginnings are roadmaps. Pay close attention to how a book of the Bible starts, what problems there are, or even like the weird things that are said that may not make sense to you until you've actually read through the rest of it. Let's look at Isaiah 1, for example. So here at the beginning of Isaiah, we see, you can actually see my notes here. A lot of what's shared here at the beginning of the book of Isaiah sets the tone for the themes and like expectations of the book. So we got Uzziah, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. A lot of the book is going to be spoken directly to them. Chapter 7 with Ahaz, chapters 36 through 39 with Hezekiah. We get references like to creation, heaven and earth, rebellion. This is all pointing back to Genesis 1 through 3. We get reference to Israel not knowing and disobedience because of that ignorance. That's a common theme in this book. We see reference to the name that he uses over and over again in this book. We see a bunch of imperative calls to action. Wash, cease, learn, seek, correct, bring, plead. This is a pattern that we see in all the prophets, but especially in Isaiah. And it's starting all here in chapter 1. It's very similar to what we see at the beginning of John, calling Jesus the Word, the light, coming in grace and truth. Those things set the scene for the rest of John to then unpack. Similar to Matthew. Matthew also starts with a genealogy, which you would think would be like wasted space. This isn't a roadmap, right? But it is. Matthew starts with a genealogy because he's writing to Jewish Christians, showing these Jewish Christians Jesus really is the Messiah, the fulfillment of your Jewish faith. Now, this is not new or unique to just Bible literature. This is something that you see in so many books and movies, whether they start with a quote, a short little pithy saying, or whatever. A lot of times the scene is set, the themes are set, the message, the goal, the aim is set right at the beginning in the first couple words. And we see that here in our Bibles as well. So whenever you start a new book of the Bible, really pay attention to what's going on in that first chapter, the first couple paragraphs. Those are some of the most important paragraphs and chapters of the book as a whole. And I literally can't think of a book of the Bible that that's not true of. Now, tip number 2 is to look at first actions. Now, this is only pretty typical in narrative stories of our Bibles. So whenever I say narrative, it doesn't mean they're not true, but it's just whenever you have like a specific character facing an obstacle. Think Jonah and the whale. Think David and Goliath. These are narratives. Ruth, Esther, you get the point. It's telling a story with a character. In narratives, especially in our Bible, pay close attention to the first thing that they're recorded doing or saying. For example, in Ruth chapter 1, if you're a Patreon, you know we just went in depth through the book and I'm coming out with a course through Ruth. It's such a rich book and like all of these things that I'm sharing today are true of this book of the Bible, but it starts off introducing Elimelech, but it doesn't even name Elimelech before it gives really important information. The information is during a famine, he left Bethlehem, the house of bread. And the irony here is somebody whose name means God is king is not trusting his God and he's leaving in a famine the house of bread. There's so much irony there just alone, and they haven't even named Elimelech yet. And that's because his actions are way more important than his name will ever be. His actions are that he's not trusting God. And this is all within like the first 2 verses of Ruth. It might just be verse 1. Let me test myself. Yeah. So you can't really see anything because my pages are crazy, but in verse 1, it says that he's leaving. Then in verse 2, it finally bothers to name him, but his actions were way more important to the narrative. Let me give you another example. Let's flip to Genesis 25. There we see that Esau is described as a red, hairy guy, and Jacob is a trickster holding his heel. You see their first descriptions are animal-like versus Jacob being cunning. Then the first description of Esau was that he was a hunter, a man of the field. And then his His first words are, let me have some of this red stew. Esau's described highlighting his animalistic characteristics because he's gonna act like an animal and only think with his stomach. Jacob is described as being quiet, reserved in the house because he's gonna be smart and he's gonna conquer over this animalistic brother. So pay close attention to the ways that people are first described. First speech, first action, even like moments like this, being born holding your brother's ankle because you're a trickster. Real quick before I move on to our next tip, which also has to do with the way that you read narratives. This video is sponsored by Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding website where you pay a monthly fee and get all this bonus content. On my Patreon, we go through in-depth studies of the Psalms every week. We also have verse mapping, live Zoom calls, vlogs. We just verse mapped through Ruth, and you get all the inside scoop of everything that's going on here at How to Feed the Life. So if you want to grow in practical Bible study tips and be like led in in-depth Bible studies through like books of the Bible, definitely check out Patreon. Right now we've started a series of all the different characteristics of God, and every month if you join the top tier, I'll send you stickers that are like a sticker study through that characteristic of God. All the information for Patreon is in the description box, and thank you to all of my patrons. You make the Bible nerd studies here on the internet happen, so thank you guys. Now back to tip number 3. Tip number 3 is particularly helpful in narratives of the Bible, and I'm gonna call it stop and dance, because oftentimes in narratives, you'll see they just stop out of nowhere, and it's either a song or a poem, sometimes it's a quote, and that's why we're calling it stop and dance. Because the people of the Bible did that a lot. Now, if you're anything like me, whenever you come to these passages of the Bible, you kind of just want to skim over them. Like, okay, Mary's song, not that important. You're just kind of like, they're just singing. It's just music. And while today, in our day and age, we listen to music that doesn't really mean anything and doesn't have any substance, the music in our Bibles, sung by the people of the ancient Near East, is theological in nature. They're singing about the acts of God and what it means for them, God's people. But even more importantly, what they stop and sing about always seems to be reflective of the themes or messages of that chapter, really the sermon of that chapter, like what it means for us today. Let me give you an example. All right, bear with me because I know I have a lot of notes in the way, but we get through all of Genesis 1 and then we stop and dance. And there's this little poem or song situation which declares that we are imago Dei, made in the image of God. So after a whole chapter setting up the creation of the world and the pinnacle of that creation, humankind, it then sings like this song about our value being made in the image of God. Then we go over here to chapter 2, ignore all my notes. I know it's a lot, but I'm making a point here. We have this whole second creation narrative highlighting the man and the marriage. And you have another song here right before chapter 3, singing of this woman, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She's the woman taken out of the man. That whole little song celebrates all that was unpacked in chapter 2. Then we have chapter 3 with the fall, and all of chapter 3 unpacks this fall, and we have a stop and dance. This is actually judgment over the sin, but as you can see, it's poetic in nature. Then we move over to chapter 4. I know I have a lot of notes. It's really rich. Again, beginning of books are important, but we have all of chapter 4 talking about Cain and Abel, and what do you see? We have a stop and dance. You can see it because it's literally printed different because it's poetry.
Lamech's poem highlights that violence is now the new normal after Cain and Abel. This is the result of the fall.
Friends, what comes out of people's mouths all throughout the narratives are really important. Speech, but especially poetic song or just poetry. When the narrative breaks, when the story stops and there's some kind of poetry in the narrative, typically, I can't think of an exception. It's like always theology or pointing to the general theme and lesson. Now, tip number 4, this is one of my favorite tips. We can call this one deja vu, but the more proper term for this would be typology. There are so many patterns throughout the Bible that we see over and over and over again. We were just looking at Cain and Abel. Well, Cain has a lot of typological stuff that goes on that's very similar to Adam. After the fall, God says, Adam, where are you? We see the same thing with Cain. When Adam gets caught, he says, oh, well, the woman you gave me ate the fruit, right? Cain does a very similar thing. And he goes, am I my brother's keeper? God asks both of them, what have you done? As part of Adam's curse is he's cursed to work the ground. Cain is cursed from the ground. There's a lot of parallels between Adam and other characters of the Bible. And this can be true of like places, like on top of mountains, people often meet God or have some kind of revelation of God. At wells, they typically meet their wives. If they're barren, they typically birth a really important person. Any kind of big act of God, like a flood or an exodus. These are all patterns of like deliverances where certain little micro things will happen over and over again. For example, in Genesis, Adam and Eve were planted in a garden, and after the flood, Noah plants a vineyard. Then Adam and Eve were in this fruitful garden, took a fruit that they weren't supposed to eat, and Noah also got drunk off of his vineyard. They both sinned in the fruitfulness around them. Adam and Eve then, after eating the fruit, discover that they're naked. Then Noah lays down naked after getting drunk. Adam and Eve, after discovering that they were naked, did what? They sewed fig leaves together to cover their nakedness. Noah then, his sons discover that he's laying there naked and they cover him up. Adam and Eve's eyes were open to see that they were naked, and Noah wakes up and discovers that he was naked. And then both narratives end in curses. There are so many patterns in the Bible. Even the Exodus, crossing over the Red Sea, is mirrored again with crossing over the Jordan into the Holy Land. Pay close attention to when you see conversations or actions happen with somebody and you're like, I've read this before with somebody else in a different situation. That's because something is happening. When patterns are followed, you're supposed to say, oh, we've been here before. Why are things starting over again? Or why are they following in the sin of their fathers? Or, oh, look, God is providing again. Or look, oh, God is starting over again. That's why Revelation 21 and 22 sounds so familiar in weird ways to like the garden in Genesis 1, only they're better, right? The Bible is so literarily rich. Don't miss the beautiful patterns.
In fact, if you want to snag a couple charts that outline these patterns as little free downloads, I'll have them linked down below in my description box.
Now, if you like super actionable Bible study tip videos like this one, you'll love this video right here. I share 10 power-packed tips, and then we put them all to the test right there in that video. I'll see you in this video. You definitely don't want to miss it. I'll see you there.